with just having more conversations
Mhm.
within our communities, being more involved in educating. Some implicit biases are things that are subconscious. So some people may not even recognize that they have certain biases towards certain groups, towards
Mhm.
certain people. So talking to people about what that looks like for them, and especially parents, starting now, talking to parents so that they can have those conversations with their children, so that as we're looking at long-term changing of systems, we
Mhm.
have to start with our individual households.
Yes.
I know I was probably one of the ones that didn't do the initial emails, and I apologize yet again. Like I am just all over the place today.
it's,
You were
it's not just
okay.
you. It's not just
Right, you're okay.
you.
You're okay. Definitely okay.
Nope, it's not
So
just you.
and I just want to say, as a council person, like I would really want to start having these conversations in our community, like actually having community forums that are focused around change, so that we
Mhm.
can, like I said, when we are part of the system of change, then we have more buy-in, we have more responsibility. So starting those conversations in our schools, having those conversations, at the council, having those conversations at the business meetings, so that it
Yes.
doesn't just change in one area. We're talking like the judge said, we're talking global conversations, but they just have to simply start someplace.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Because and also taking that a step further, we also encourage people to attend city council meetings more often, and then
Yes,
you can
every
become more aware of what's going on in your community. Because a lot of people
yes.
don't attend, but a lot of people always have a lot of suggestions on what needs to be done, but they never attend any city council meetings to even be heard. Because you guys are the ones that listen, listen to to us citizens. So you are the ones we have to
So, do you think if the more conversations that are being held, such as this, that will enable our citizens to open up more, if they see that you guys are not so hard to reach, approachable, because a lot of people
Mhm.
think, people of higher positions aren't approachable. Because I know I was one of those few people before I really got into it. And I didn't think
I
people
was gonna say,
really.
I met
So it's like is I think if we have more of these discussions like this and they see more of you guys on a different level besides in your positions, um, I think they will open up more and be able to suggest more, and tell, hey, this is what I would like to see in our community, and this is what I feel about, about this legislation or this bill, or why can't we implement this, or let's try this summer. I think, because if you have more conversations, because yeah, the kids that we had the other day, they were talking,
Mhm.
and it was the conversation that they were having was just totally mind-boggling, because you never would have thought that kids 9, 10, and 8 years old would have these type of conversations, and they were basically talking about black and white issues, and they were black and white issues regarding the police, um,
Mhm.
Mhm.
and they were like, I would make laws changing that, if a if a white cop shoots a black person and they are unarmed, yeah, they go into jail automatically. So we need to listen
Mhm.
to our kids a lot more and our citizens, because I think, yeah, more conversations like this do need to be heard, because like I said, it was mind-boggling to me to hear these young men discuss these things.
Mhm.
And I think for the citizens of Muskegon Heights, the relevance of coming to council meetings or even just reaching out to your council members is that my experiences are different than Councilman Williams, that are different than Councilwoman McLaughlin's, that are different than the citizens. So when we have that voice, when I know what your concerns are, because let's be honest, your concerns may not be my concerns, but it doesn't mean
Mhm.
they're not worthy to be heard or to be addressed. So come to the meetings, or and if you don't have time to come to the meetings, we're virtual now. I don't know how long that's going to last, but we are. Um, it's important that you find a way to get what you need heard, because again, we and at the end of the day, as much as you try to make decisions so that everyone is encompassed, my decision making tool is based on who I am as a person. It's based on my education. It's based on how I was raised. It's based on how many kids I have, which are not necessarily things that are concern for you. So in order to have a well-rounded decision-making team, we have to always incorporate who we're making decisions for. And the best way to do that is to hear from the citizens, what are we not doing right? What can we be doing better? What should we be working on right now? That voice is where we as a council should be led through. Because again, like I said, we each bring different aspects to the table when we are making decisions regarding council or regarding the city. But we also have to make sure that we are reaching out to also incorporate that voice of our citizens. I hope that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. It makes total sense because, like you said, I absolutely agree with what you said because, and also we as citizens, we have to reach out to you guys also because you can't hear what we can sit in the house and say they need to do this and they need to do that or whatever. You can't hear me saying that from the house. So I have to reach out to you too. And again, like you say, your issues may not be the same issues as mine, but if you don't know as a councilwoman what my issue is, then how can it be fixed or how can it be addressed?
Yes.
Totally agree.
And speaking of decisions, we have one of the men and a guy that I truly admire because he makes a lot of decisions in the city of Muskegon Heights as well, alongside Ms. Councilwoman Cook. And he has a big responsibility, and I respect this man so much for that. The city of Muskegon Heights city manager, Mr. Troy Bell. Now, Mr. Bell, I totally understand you are a man that wear many hats, and I totally understand that. We really respect what you do in our community. And the same question posed to you, sir. What will you do, as city manager, to begin racial healing, and what can we do as a whole to do the same?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I always have to start by saying, particularly in this case, it is an honor to be considered amongst the fellow panelists, and especially with one of my 7 bosses, Councilwoman Kitchen. So that said, I think it's important to point out that the council is the decision-making arm of the city. They create policy, they identify direction, they codify the vision for the city. The role of the city manager is to execute on that vision and on those policies. And in that regard, as a city manager, what I can and cannot do has certain limitations. But I think in the broad discussion of the idea of racial healing, I can take off one hat and put on another hat. And like you said, I do wear several hats, but I'm also a PhD student who is studying the issues of race and poverty and the dynamics of those factors as it intersects with and overlaps with education. That's the area of my dissertation. And I've been honored on several occasions to be able to participate in diversity and inclusion workshops and facilitate with multiple police departments in their training around this issue, having been a Miami police officer for several years, and being able to see things from that perspective. And I think it's important to understand that in order for racial healing to occur, we first have to understand what our objective is. I mean, from my experience across the country, and I've lived in 13 different states growing up in the military and traveled extensively with my job, racial healing is something that is typically advocated for by people of color, by minorities, not the mainstream, and not typically by Caucasians. And oftentimes when we talk about racial healing, and I talk about this when I facilitate, it is from a perspective of wanting to heal as a minority. But I think we have to broaden that perspective and talk about what is our objective? How do we bring healing across um, our community and other communities? And in order to achieve that, there's got to be a dialogue. I mean, it begins with a dialogue. And I've heard several of our panelists mention acknowledging white privilege. And we all understand that that's a component of it, but in most sessions where our objective is to really, truly achieve racial healing, it doesn't begin with an acknowledgement of racial privilege. So the question becomes, how do we get there? How do we get to acknowledgement of racial, of white privilege, I should say. And in order to do that, we have to create an environment where a dialogue can take place. And a prerequisite for that is understanding that the objective is not to blame, it's to understand. It's not to walk in there and say it's your fault because of this and your fault because of that, because really the folks that are in that room are not the architects of the system that we're in. Although people of color are the victims of the system that we're in. So really realizing that when we walk in the room, that this isn't about a blame session. This is about about achieving an understanding. We want, as minorities, as people of color, as Black folks, to be heard, to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to be given access to solutions to the issues that are structurally in place, that are systematically in place. And typically the folks that need to realize or learn or come to acknowledgement of white privilege are, like I said, are not architects. I mean, the person who's standing on the train is as much as or as little responsible for where the train drops them off, because they didn't design the train, they didn't make the train, and they're typically not running the train. So, but they are the benefactors of the train. And so getting folks to understand that is part of the racial healing process that we need to go through. And I think the question becomes, how do we get there? And I said, first of all, we need to get rid of blaming. Because when I do sessions, when I facilitate, people come into those sessions on the offensive and on the defensive, and right there, people are shut down. And you don't achieve healing when people walk in the door with their ears covered, their eyes closed. Or if you do, the folks that are there are not the ones that you need to talk to.
Yes.
Okay, you're preaching to the choir. So how do we get to those folks that need to understand? And in my research and the work that I'm doing in my area of inquiry, what I've learned is that a lot of this has to do with getting to the history, a common understanding of the historical perspectives. And some of the panel members have already mentioned, we need to understand the history. But I think the nuance of that is we need to understand the historical perspectives. And what I mean when I say that is, two people can look at the same event and perceive it entirely different. And we need to understand what those varying perspectives are in order to be able to assess and deal with them in such a way that a dialogue can be meaningful and productive. And so understanding the historical perspectives of the various events also gives us an opportunity to begin to educate people on events that like if I talk about Bacon's Rebellion, most people have no idea what Bacon's Rebellion is.
I don't.
But, okay, historically, Bacon's Rebellion is the start of chattel slavery. Okay, and so not to get off on a tangent about what that is, but when you understand the dynamics of that, that was the first rebellion where Blacks and whites worked together against the idea of changing the rules around servitude, indentured servitude. And so when they saw that Blacks and whites were working together to fight indentured servitude, they said, oh, heck no. Well, they probably used a different word, but we're not going to let this happen. So we need to separate those folks and put people in one category and people in another category, and there the two should meet on the same level. There's got to be a hierarchy, and that hierarchy was the beginning of, at least based on my research, beginning of chattel slavery in the United States in 1676. So understanding the historical elements, understanding the historical perspectives is a basis by which we can begin to understand And we can begin to have a dialogue that's not built on blaming, but rather understanding the systems that are in place, understanding the dynamics of those systems and the structure that's in place. We are victims of colonialism. Colonialism is a structure that says that your sole purpose is to benefit me. That's the system of colonialism. And so slavery is a natural progression of colonialism. This idea that you only exist to benefit the other. And that's okay in their perspective of history. So you see that colonialism is a natural progression of, slavery is a natural progression of colonialism, and the structures around that are the structures that created our country, despite the fact that constitutionally we ascribe to this concept that we should be able to change our stars, that we should not be victims of how we're born or who we're born or where we're born or who we're born to, that based on our character and our effort and our industry, we should be able to determine who we become. No more nobility and serfs that we should. So therein lies the conundrum in our country. But understanding that conundrum in the context of the natural forces of colonialism and slavery is to understand the dynamics of which we are conflicted at our core. We are conflicted from the very beginning in the structures that were set up and the systems that were put into place. And if we can have a conversation about the structures and the systems and where they come from, we can begin to understand the dynamics that control how white people work in that system, are affected by that system, as some of the panelists had said before, and how Black folks are affected, people of color, Latinos, African Americans, et cetera, and any minority within that structure are affected. You wanted to weigh in, Ms. Hernandez?
Yeah, I see Sonia has her hand up.
I do. I just want to piggyback off something you said, Mr. Bell.
Mhm.
I've heard you use the word minority several times, and there's power in words. And when you look up the definition of minority, it is
Who can't make decisions on their
like
own.
it's subservient, it is below. And when we use that word to define ourselves, we are perpetuating the belief that we are less than. When in fact, if Hispanics and Latinos were not forced to mark white on the census, we would be the majority.
Right.
And so there's also power in the word empower, because when we use that word, we're unintentionally perpetuating the belief that women, children, and people of color are always in need of help and rescue.
Waiting for
Because I have
Superman.
yet to find a nonprofit organization that has in their mission statement, they are there to empower white men. I challenge anyone on this panel or anyone who's listening, find me a mission statement that says that. Because most nonprofits' mission statements are to empower women, children, and people of color. So when we use the word empower, which means to grant permission, we are saying women, children, and people of color need somebody to grant them permission to be their full self, their best self. And we need to be mindful of words that we've been conditioned and socialized to use to keep ourselves and this whole mindset perpetuating out of our own mouths.
Exactly.
Well, I certainly do appreciate that. And I find myself conflicted on those survey questions because there's no place for Afro-Latinos. We're in that category where you're not Black, you're not Latino. So I do understand that those are powerful signals, and thank you for providing me with that correction, because I did not mean to fall on the wrong side of the right best terminology.
I'm also an educator, so I couldn't help myself.
Trust me, I know that all too well. Because also, and piggybacking off the word minority, also, to my understanding, is pretty much someone who can't make decisions on their own, or like a child or something like that. That's what I also read about minority. And I'm guilty of saying minority myself, even though I am aware of the meaning of it. But sometimes I just find myself using the same word. So And Mr. Troy Bell, I remember you saying during the time you were talking, you mentioned something about history. Now, do you believe that when someone, because I was told this before, but just in your opinion, do you believe when someone doesn't know their history, they tend to repeat it?
Absolutely. I think even, I mean, even if we do know our history, there is a tendency to repeat it. So
Yes.
Yes.
if you have no idea of the hole that's there, you're likely to fall in it. And so at least if you know that it's there in advance, you have an opportunity to work to avoid it. So, I mean, history is a critical part of what we need to get into both communities. The systems that have been at work in terms of the way that we transfer knowledge in this country have not served people of color, nor have they served the majority well. What's the statement that says that, the quote, and I won't get it right, so I'm paraphrasing, the man that puts his foot on the neck of another man puts himself in a situation where both men are stuck. And so we cannot move unless we both understand, have an understanding of the history that's there, or like you said, we'll repeat it. And another quote that I think is important in the discussion about racial healing is that this, and it's attributed both to, I think it's Frantz Fanon and also Audre Lorde. You cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And so we need to break our system down to its core, to its lowest denominator, and reconstruct it after we separate out the components of the structural racism and systematic racism that built this country. And so a discussion around how that looks, one of the things that I use in facilitating and consulting is the power triangle, where you create a triangle and you ask everybody to identify where they fit on that triangle, from the top of the triangle at the point down to the bottom. You ask them to identify themselves, and then you ask them to identify others where they are on that triangle. And you look at that triangle from the standpoint of the power dynamic. At the top is the highest power, and at the bottom is the least power. And you begin to get people to look at not only themselves, but how they exist in conjunction with other people. And that gets you out of the discussion, away from the discussion of who's at fault or who's to blame. And you begin to have a discussion about the dynamics that exist, the reality of the dynamics that exist around which we operate. And one last thing I'll say, the part about being seen, I will share from my experience, having been in many parts of the country, the unique experience when I go to a community that's different, a new community, I should say. We can usually get a sense of that community by whether or not I am visible or invisible. And both of those tend to be a bad thing, because if I walk into a community and people do not acknowledge that I exist, or I walk into the community and the people see me as somebody who does not have a right to be there, in both cases, I'm not being seen for who I truly am. I'm being either invisible or seen as a pariah in those environments. And so when we talk about racial healing, getting folks who have never experienced that to understand the difference between being seen, being heard, being acknowledged, and given access to equity is that conflict between being seen, being invisible, and being seen as somebody who has no right to be in that space. So.
Okay, I have one question for you, and then we're gonna wrap up and move on. Now, I've heard everybody say educate, 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 educate the last few days. Now,
right.
Our younger generation, they are educated. They know, they might not know like past the 19, I say they might not know under between the 1920s and the 1940s, but I can honestly say between the 1950s and the 1970s, they pretty much have been educated. But the thing is, they don't really care. because it doesn't fit into their world as of today. So that part of our history to which got us to where we are today, they don't understand that. So how do we get them interested into where they can understand that, to where we can begin to racial healing, both Black and white? Because neither Black or white, the younger generations, they don't care really about the past. They feel like, okay, we all get along now because we don't care about that. So how do we actually get them to understand?
So I'll take a crack at that, and having been a former school superintendent, but I will defer at the end to Ms. Garcia, since she's in the trenches now. But I will say this: we have to look at school differently. We have to understand that education is not something that resides only in a classroom. That we have to look comprehensively at education and learning as a function that occurs throughout society. And I would say, this is just my opinion, one of the challenges that we've had over the years is that education in the Black community, at least, was not just relegated to the school before the civil rights movement. It was in the community. When you walk down the street, if you were doing something wrong, I mean, when I would walk down the street, if I was doing something wrong, my mother knew it before I got home, because usually somebody was chasing me with a switch down the road. So as the community, that piece of accountability was also that piece of educating you about the difference between right and wrong. You know, folks knew that my mother would not allow us in out after the street lights came on. So I didn't have to worry about my mother coming to get us. The folks that knew that I was in trouble were already on the phone or chasing us down the street. So as a community, we have to come together and embrace education on an emotional level as well as an academic level. The systems that used to be in place, like clubs and organizations, churches, church groups, have been marginalized to a great degree in our contemporary society. So we can't depend on those things until we can. And in the meantime, we have to figure out ways to empower those systems to have the impact or effect that they used to have, or be creative and innovative in other ways that we can comprehensively create accountability and education. So I'll finish with just putting a plug in for our Citizens Academy. So that's an initiative from the city standpoint of being able to bring people in from the community and teach them about how government operates, how the city operates. And that's not in the classroom, that is real life. You know, that's a real life education. And so those are the types of things that we need to try to invest in more comprehensively, to provide opportunities for people, adults, children, teens to be accountable and to learn at the same time, while also working frantically to help lift up our existing traditional education system in the classroom.
Yes.
Okay, well,
And I say
thank
frantically,
you,
frantically.
Well, thank you, Mr. Troy Bell, Muskegon Heights City Manager. We really appreciate that insightful input, and we really do. Now we are going to move on to the NAACP, Mr. Floyd Cook Jr. And the same question goes to you.
Hey, thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to step out on a limb and say that I'm probably the grandfather in this group of people in terms of longevity.
Yeah.
And although I represent the NAACP, I'm the membership chairperson. As we talk about education and the need to dialogue, I was also affiliated with an organization here in Muskegon County called the Institute for Healing Racism, which brought together a diverse group of persons from around the community, starting from 1998. And through the Institute, which was an educational dialogue format, almost 4,000 people from Western Michigan, particularly Muskegon County, and nearby counties, went through the Institute's program of 18 hours of dialogue, face-to-face, sharing, but with a particular 10-point curriculum. The whole issue of what we're talking about as far as healing racism, one of the most valuable points is that we have to share total history of where it came from in the first place. And we'll keep it within the context of the founding of this country. And what, let me say to the point that Michelle mentioned, that certain portions of our younger congregation, I'm going to church already. That is another format and place where the conversations need to be held over and beyond the effort of continuing to sell Jesus and God, okay? And I can relate to what Mr. Bell mentioned about the neighborhood back in the day. We didn't even have a telephone, and if I was in the wrong on one side of the neighborhood, somehow or another, the word got back. And so it's that I'm one of the kids who grew up and was, a neighborhood kid, okay? But getting back to the point of education and the NAACP, its basic premise has been from its founding, and it goes back to being the oldest civil rights organization in our country. It goes back to 1909. Our local chapter was formed in 1919. And some of us may remember a legend in our neighborhood. It started in the home of Mr. Bill William Gill. His family started the local chapter of the NAACP.
Okay.
And I was fortunate to be a part of the youth chapter back in the 50s and early 60s. And so the continual need for education and awareness of where we've come from has been the struggle. And unfortunately, the history of our country has been documented